Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's presentation on Terns and Plovers with Elsa Forsberg, Nebraska Game and Park biologist. A few more people might be joining, but we're going to get started. My name is Laura Coates, and I'm an AmeriCorps member with Conservation Nebraska. Our Common Ground program, Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have a few housekeeping rules to go over. For those joining online, your cameras are off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Please type any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those at some point during the presentation. We will have a very brief survey following the presentation that should only take less than a minute to complete. This survey helps support programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. Tonight, we welcome Elsa Forsberg, a non-game bird biologist at the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, who grew up in Lincoln and earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in fishery and wildlife biology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And we're going to talk about terns and plovers.
Okay. That's me. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Laura. And hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. I guess I hope they can hear us. But okay, as Laura said, my name is Elsa Forsberg, and I'm a non-game bird biologist at the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission, where I primarily work with least terns and piping plovers in their conservation, which is what we are going to talk about today. So what's a least tern and what's a piping plover? If you're not familiar, on the screen here, we've got an adult least tern, and then on the other side, we have an adult piping plover. And these two birds are grouped together often for two reasons. The first being they have very similar habitat requirements, so they're often found together at the same time. And let's see, okay, good. Thank you for letting us know we can hear you. Okay, or you can hear me. And the second reason that they're often grouped together is because while they're often in the same place at the same time, they are also both species of conservation concern. Click. So what does habitat then look like for terns and plovers? Well, the two main ingredients are sand and water, specifically sand that doesn't have a lot of vegetation and is near the water. So typically that then means that terns and plovers will be found along sandy beaches of coastlines, as well as shorelines of lakes and reservoirs and wetlands, as well as river sandbars. And these birds are in their nesting habitats to raise their young from about April until August. So this map shows the ranges for both of these species, where the orange highlighted regions are showing their breeding ranges. So that's where they nest and raise their young. So least terns have populations along the Gulf and Atlantic coasts. And it's a little hard to see, but in the interior of the US, least terns also breed along river systems in the Great Plains. And then there's a subspecies in California. And in the winter, in this blue shaded region is where they will go in the wintertime to spend actually about 75% of the year in that blue region there in South America and the Caribbean. And then for piping plovers, on the other map, they have 3 different breeding populations, one also along the Atlantic coast. Then there's a population in the Great Lakes, and then in the Great Plains. So for Nebraska, we find ourselves in those interior Great Plains populations. So we'll get to know these birds a little bit better here in these few slides. So the least tern is called such because it's the smallest tern species that we have in North America, not least because it has anything to do with how cool the bird is, but because of how small it is. And it's characterized by or distinguished from other tern species in North America by that white forehead and then the yellow beak that it has. And terns are piscivorous, which means they eat fish. So you'll often see them hovering and flying around above the water, and occasionally they'll then hover, stop, and dive real quick towards the water. It looks like they just smack the surface, and if they come up successful, they'll have a fish like this guy does. Piping plovers are a small shorebird, and their distinctive characteristic is that black neck band and their black brow band with their orange legs and a black tipped orange beak. They can often be confused, particularly in the Great Plains, with killdeer, which is in the plover family, but a lot larger in body size and more brown, whereas the plover is gray. And it also has two of those neck bands instead of just one. So I always talk about that a little bit with people, because another thing is if you think you see a plover in a parking lot, look again. If it has two neck bands, it's a killdeer. If it's actually a plover in a parking lot, I would have some more follow-up questions for the bird, probably. So because piping plovers are insectivorous, so they eat insects and invertebrates, primarily that they find as they forage along in the sand. So if you see them running around, they'll stop every once in a while and peck at the ground. And in their more marine habitats, it's a bit amusing to watch this happen because they'll almost primarily be eating these marine worms, that they'll do a cool behavior where they'll raise one of their feet just above the surface of the sand and tremble it, which sends these vibrations into the sand to bring the worms up. And I just think it's kind of cute when they do that. So living life on the sand means being a ground nesting bird. There's no trees to put your nests in. So terns and plovers will lay their eggs in little bowl-shaped depressions that they carve out into the sand. And being a ground nesting bird also means that you're a little more vulnerable to predation, especially from like foxes and raccoons, coyotes that can find your nest pretty easily. So they use this camouflage method with the speckling pattern on the eggs to help blend them in with the sand. So these are some examples of piping plover nests. Plovers will almost always lay 4 eggs, but they could have 3 or 5, but they're always very neatly arranged with the narrow ends pointed inward, and they'll also line their nests with pebbles like this, or shells, or whatever is available. Terns are a little bit messier. They don't line their nests with pebbles. They'll have 2 to 3 eggs, but whatever gets the job done, gets the job done. And I've actually found a tern nest in one of my old footprints before. So they're interesting birds. But a plover on the nest blends in pretty well with the sand also, with that buffy gray color, and they kind of look a bit like a rock. So when we're out in the field, we sort of play a game of plover or rock. We're looking for nests from a distance. And terns look sort of like a stick when they're on the nest. And so for both of these species, the parents will share nest incubating duties. And for terns, since they eat fish, it's kind of cool. One of the parents who's not on duty will bring back food, sort of like a DoorDash, or I guess a nest dash, for the parent who is warming the eggs, or the chicks, like this cute little chick here. So you'll know that you're near a tern nest, or rather a tern colony, because terns tend to nest in groups together, if instead of flying around over the water, they start flying around over you. And they might even start making these really cute, high-pitched squawking noises. And if you get really close, they'll start actually dive bombing you and dropping little gifts, which of course are intended to deter predators and threats like well-meaning biologists away from their nests and their young, which is what I call the swoop and poop method. But thankfully their aim is not always on par. So piping plovers will take a less aggressive nest defense approach and instead do what is called the broken wing display, which is pictured on this slide here. So what the adult is doing is, as As you, the well-meaning biologist or citizen who's just walking along the beach, is getting too close, the adult will say, "Oh no, I am easy prey and I am injured. Please follow me," in an attempt to lure you away. And if you play along, or if you're a fox that doesn't know any better, they'll lure you far enough away and then suddenly fly away, all better, but you are left stranded with no idea where their nest could possibly be. And that's the entire point. So plovers will incubate their eggs for 4 weeks, at which point the chicks will hatch. And different from passerines like robins and blue jays, these chicks will hatch fully feathered and their eyes are able to open. And after a few hours, they start to fluff up and look a lot cuter. And they can actually get up and out of the nest within a few hours of hatching and start running around and learning how to feed themselves, which is advantageous for a species that is on the ground where it could be easily discovered by a predator. But thankfully for these piping plover chicks, they are very fast on those little toothpick-looking legs. These terns will hatch after 3 weeks. They're also fully feathered when they hatch, and they'll fluff up and start looking cuter too. They retain this speckly pattern to help them blend in with the sand better, which is helpful because terns, instead of plover chicks, they have shorter legs and webbed toes. So instead of being able to run, they go at more of a waddle and do what I call the stop and plop method of defense. So if they see you coming, what they're going to do is stop, drop, and hope they blend in with the sand so that you don't see them. They'll hide under little plants like this and generally be very cute. And so this tern chick here is a few weeks older, but he still can't fly yet. So since terns eat fish, they have to rely on their parents to bring them food while they are in this flightless stage still. This one's in a bit of an awkward stage. But eventually their flight feathers come in, and this guy here is about 3 weeks old, and he's probably flight capable at this point, and he can start learning how to fish for himself, which is also entertaining to watch if you ever get a chance. This then is a flight capable plover chick that looks a lot like the parents, except it doesn't have those black neckband markings or the unibrow. But this is actually what the adults will start to look like when they get ready to head south for the winter. So this guy's ready to go. So now that you're a little familiar with terns and plovers, let's talk about what their population status is. So these are both species of conservation concern that have been listed on the endangered species list since the 1980s. So for least terns, they were originally listed as endangered. So that's about the top rank you can be before you're in endangerment of being extinct. But thankfully for least terns, through some conservation efforts, their populations have recovered enough that they are removed from this status in 2021 because their populations are doing a lot better, primarily in the southern Mississippi part of their range. But we do protect them still as a state endangered species in Nebraska at the moment. Piping plovers were listed as threatened, so that's one step below endangered, but they have maintained this status since the 80s. Their populations are about stable or declining in most places. So the primary reason for the population decline and listing of both of these species was habitat loss and habitat degradation. So as you can imagine, birds that live their lives on sandy beaches and river habitats might also be where humans want to live and recreate. So the development of coastal areas and barrier islands, along with the shoreline stabilization maintenance projects that come with preserving those developments and infrastructures, means that there's generally less habitat available for terns and plovers to nest. And on river habitats with the sandbars, dams and diversions and bank stabilizations change the flow regimes of rivers that would otherwise, or at least historically, better produce sandbars that are suitable for tern and plover nesting, which still occurs but has been reduced. So, of course, in addition to that, sometimes when there could be good habitat, it may not be functionally suitable, given that human disturbance on beaches and sandbars can also disturb nesting adults and keep their adults and chicks away from good foraging grounds. So generally, these are their current reasons for decline. But do remember, terns have been doing better due to some good habitat conservation efforts in some parts of their range. So I'll focus now on the status of terns and plovers and their situation specifically in Nebraska. So this map shows where terns and plovers are found in Nebraska when they are here to breed in the summer months. So you can see these highlighted gold regions are showing that the Niobrara and the upper Missouri reaches, as well as the Platte River with a little bit on the Loop and the Elkhorn, are where terns and plovers are typically found, where their habitat, their natural habitat at least, are river sandbars, like this picture here of the Platte River around Louisville. So ideally and historically, these sandbars on the Platte River are created when sediment is carried down from the Rocky Mountains with snowmelt all the way through the watershed, and it's deposited in these braided channels of river that make these sandbars. And the Platte River has a pretty dynamic flow regime where there's periodic episodes of high water that will scour vegetation off of sandbars and make new ones. And that's what makes tern and plover habitat on a river. But with some of the changes that we talked about to the river system, this happens less and less, such that there tends to be an overall decline in the amount of sandbar habitat available for terns and plovers. So they might be sandbars that are overly vegetated or too low of elevation that they are frequently flooded, which is not good for nests. But interestingly enough, with these changes in the river hydrology, there's also been the advent of what we call off-river nesting sites. So there's the Platte River channel in the corner down there, but then just adjacent are these expanses of sparsely vegetated sand that are still near water. And terns and plovers will continue to nest here, and I've circled those in red on this slide. So most of these off-river sites are created by the sand and gravel mining industry. So what happens is the sand and gravel mine comes into these areas and they're pulling sand and gravel aggregate that is basically old riverbed deposits under the topsoil. And as they extract that out, the water table fills in, which creates this lake. And the company will filter the grains of sand and gravel that they want to sell commercially, but what they don't want to sell, they distribute as waste sand around the lake, which is what creates this expanses of sand that the terns and plovers will nest on. So these mines, why they incidentally create habitat, also have a lot of activity going on with big trucks and machinery moving around. But there are some quieter spots on the waste sand where terns and plovers will nest, although sometimes they'll nest by the road, which makes interesting situations for me, the biologist. But here behind this stick, there's a tern chick that's freshly hatched with an egg. And in the background, you can see the pipe. That is what's pumping out the sand that's creating the sand the terns are nesting on. So eventually, over time, the company will finish production at a site and it'll either turn back into ag land, or what often happens is that the location will be purchased by a real estate developer with the intent to turn it into a lakeshore housing development. So at this point, in this transitional stage, the developer is shaping the sand to make cul-de-sacs and peninsulas and the like. And it takes about 1 to 3 years, at which point we consider this stage to be called a transition site. And they tend to have a lot of open sand that can host a large number of terns and plover nests. But eventually, houses are built. And at this point, we consider the site to be a housing development. And terns and plovers will continue to nest here so long as there is open sand habitat available. For example, this is a plover nest here with just 1 egg in it, but it's in what's remaining to be an empty lot at the moment. It's about the only empty lot left on this housing development, and it's almost entirely or really close to this person's backyard. And on the other side, behind the camera, is a sand volleyball court. So just to illustrate that process, this is an example of one site going from a sand and gravel mine with all of the mining equipment and the dredge to becoming a transition site where the peninsula and the cul-de-sacs are formed and there's roads. And then now there are homes in residence and it's a housing development. So Terns and plovers that nest at these off-river sites are monitored by the Tern and Plover Conservation Partnership, which is a collaboration of regulatory agencies, since these are federally and state protected birds. So that includes the Fish and Wildlife Service on the federal side, as well as the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission on the state side. And then that's in partnership with research institutions like the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, as well as then the mine companies and homeowners. So this partnership was created in the late 1990s with the intent to facilitate a proactive cooperation and collaboration to protect these birds where they nest at these sites, and to also reduce human-wildlife conflicts. As you can imagine, if you have nesting birds where you're trying to build a house, that can create some conflict. So the partnership has done a very good job over the decades to form some good relationships and protect birds, which a lot of that groundwork has been put in before I joined, because I was not part of this partnership in the 90s. But as we're monitoring and locating nests and protecting them from disturbances, we're also communicating with our partners and collecting data on the nests and the chicks and the adults, with the intent that we can use that to do some research and learn more about these birds and how we can better protect them going forward. So our work with the partnership is focused in this general area of this red circle here, where we're on the lower portion of the Platte River, including the Loop and the Elkhorn, which are tributaries to the Platte. So I'll generally refer to this as the lower Platte River system. So every summer when the birds arrive, we start our surveys in April, and we'll visit each of the sites that we have in our partnership once a week to determine if there is any terns or plovers present and if there's any nesting going on. And if there are any nests, then we will search for them and locate them, which can be easier said than done, because in the foreground here, there is a tern nest with a couple eggs and a chick, with some of the commercial sand piles and equipment in the background. But when we do find a nest, the first thing we do is determine how old it is so we can predict when it will hatch. And we can do that by floating the eggs, and based on how they float, we can tell how old they are. We'll record how many eggs there are and take a GPS point for the location. And we'll mark the nest, communicate with our partners and the site operators so the birds can go about their business and the mines can go about their business as well. And we'll come back and visit each nest once a week until it hatches or fails, but hopefully it hatches. And housing developments then can bring their own challenges, because instead of mining equipment, the birds contend with construction, dogs, and residents that are using the sand and the beaches as well. But to help the birds and to help everyone be informed, we have some signs that we put up, and we can mark off nesting areas to create a buffer and limit disturbances and problems while the birds are active. For plovers, we'll also put up what are called nest exclosures to further protect them primarily from predators like foxes and raccoons and raptors, and also sometimes people's dogs and cats. So these allow the adults to go in and out between the wire, but the predators most of the time cannot. So I mentioned that while we're monitoring these birds, we're also collecting data. So that includes tracking nest survival as well as chick survival, like this cute little tern chick here with its, you can see its webbed toes. And we'll track the adults as well, as long as whatever other research we deem responsible at the time. So I figured I'd just share with you a quick summary of some of the recent work that we've collected, and found out that we've been able to statistically confirm that the nest exclosures we use do improve the nest success of these plovers, and that nest survival at our off-river sites is very similar, at least not different, from nest survival on sandbars. And we also found that the survival of plovers is consistent with the rest of their Great Plains population, despite the fact that they're at these human-created sites that have a lot of disturbance. So those are all pieces of good news for us after we've been collecting data and protecting birds in this way for the last couple of decades. So one of our methods for doing this research involves marking birds, or banding. If you've ever heard of bird banding, it's a pretty common research method. So this plover here has a couple of colored plastic leg bands, and these leg bands kind of operate like a license plate for each individual bird, where instead of a code of letters and numbers like you would have on a license plate, we've got a code of color combinations. that are unique to each individual. So whenever we see this bird again, we can write down that color combination and look it up in our database, and it links to the individual, which is helpful because then every time we see this bird again, we know that it's still alive, or we know it moved from place to place, or it stayed in the same place. And another thing that's cool is that not only are we seeing these birds when they come back every summer, but anyone who has a camera or the ability and a little bit of luck can also see these birds and take a picture and record the band. And that comes back to us as a data point, not only of where our birds go, but also to know that they're still around, even if they aren't coming back to our system. For example, on this map, every yellow point is a bird that we banded here on the lower Platte and where it went during the wintertime, because they're only here for about 3 months out of the year. So 75% of the time they're somewhere else, which if we're looking at conservation of these species, anything that we do here in their breeding grounds is important, but if there's something going on where they're at for the rest of the year, that's also good to coordinate and know. So it's interesting data as well. So we've got this bird here who consistently went to the same island off the coast of Texas, just south of Corpus Christi, for about 3 or 5 years, where he was seen by the same biologist every year. And we've also got this bird who was a bit of a star last year because we banded him in May. And then 2 months later, got an email from a biologist down in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico saying, hey, I found your bird. So that's about a 1,500-mile journey, which is a pretty long migration journey for a bird that only weighs about 50 grams, which I only operate in grams, so I can't give you the conversion in ounces at the moment. But yeah, so we banded this bird as an adult, so we don't know how many times he's made that journey, but he's at least done it twice because he's there right now. And I'll end with a little story here about this little lady. So this plover is plover number 274. And one thing that's really cool about her, which I've already spoiled, I guess, on this slide here, is that she's at least 12 years old. So we banded her as an adult way back in 2013. And so if you're a plover and you're breeding as an adult, it means you're at least a year old, and it's 2024 now, so she's at least 12. But the average lifespan of a piping plover is 5 years. So she's more than doubled that, which is pretty incredible. And we have a few birds that hit that 8, 9, 10-year mark in our database, but this gal is definitely at the top of the charts, at least for the birds that we have that we know are currently still around at this moment. And she's also been quite a celebrity this year because that orange circle on the map in the corner is where she has her winter home on a beach in Miami, Florida, where she is very charismatic, or at least I assume she is, because I get a lot of reports about her, and they've got at least 3 already for this fall that she's made it all the way there again. But she's also made a bit of a name for herself here this summer because not only has she been coming back and raising young every year, contributing her share of the population recovery, but this year she withstood a hailstorm on the nest. So if you were around Nebraska in June, there was a lot of hailstorms, and particularly in Fremont, I think at one day they had about 6 inches of rain in an hour. And I was getting messages from the guys at the mine saying that bird is still sitting on this nest. It's incredible. The hail's broken our windshields on our trucks. But she sat on that nest, she protected her eggs, and she raised all 4 of her chicks this summer. So this little lady is where I'm going to leave it. And just say that all of this work and all of this data and all of these relationships that we have with our partners would not have been possible without all of the people that came before me, as well as all of our field technicians that are out working in the summer heat with me every day to track these birds and their nests and protect them. So I want to say thank you also to you guys here at Conservation Nebraska for what you do and paying attention to conservation in our world. So, and thank you for inviting me today. Okay. I guess, I have one more slide. If you want to learn more about terns and plovers, you can look at the face of this cute little tern chick and decide to go to these links. We have a website that talks more about the partnership and the work that we do. And there's also a page, Flat Basin Time Lapse, if you've heard of them. A few years ago, they made some great videos as well as some education materials that talk more about terns and plovers in Nebraska as well. So if that's something you want to take a look at, we'll leave that up.
Thank you, Elsa.
Okay.
There's a few questions.
Okay.
Someone asked, how large of a buffer zone do you establish when you use buffers to protect nests?
So that probably depends on the area and the location. Because sometimes these birds will nest in the same area together, so then we'll put the buffer around the entire nesting area. If it's just a single nest, it's probably about 10 feet. But it can just depend on the situation as well. Given just how much activity is at the mine and that sort of thing.
Another person asked, if I find a nest near my property, what should I do? How can I best protect them?
So I would say if you do find a nest, to report that to if you're in Nebraska, to the Game and Parks Commission. And because that's some data that we'd like to have, it's probably a new location. And to protect them, I would just give them their space. And if you have any dogs or cats, to try and keep them away. But most of the time, these birds know what to do and they can do their thing. And if you've contacted us, then we can help you also go forward with it. Thank you for the questions.
Thank you everyone for attending. And if you could fill out the Q&A, that would be really helpful to do more educational events. If anyone has any more questions, you can type them in the chat.